Get into the hearing room pretty quickly, so
Yeah,
we don't want to wait too much time. Well, then, welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here on this beautiful Seattle day. We were almost outside with the 45-mile-an-hour gusts. My name is Doug Howell. I work for the Sierra Club, and we are here to talk about the tremendous opportunity now to finally take some responsibility at the federal level for carbon rules as they relate to power plants. And as we make this transition to cleaner fuels and cleaner energy, there is a tremendous opportunity for Washington and the region for clean energy jobs, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. As you know, EPA is here today for the listening session, and they're going to be taking all of our views, and we wanted to give a sampling of some views today in different perspectives, so this is a little bit of a primer before we go into the listening session. And I want to set the table to talk about what we've done here in Washington State. We have done our heavy lifting on power plants. We have an emissions performance standard here in Washington State for new power plants that is the strongest in the country. In 2011, we passed legislation, thanks to good people like Representative Zach Hudgens, who you'll be hearing from momentarily, where we are now retiring our one and only coal plant in Washington State. That coal plant was 10% of our emissions profile. It has enough power to provide electricity for the city the size of Seattle. And we were the ones who made that transition. And in that transition, we also took care of the workers and the community by providing them with $55 million for economic development and clean energy in their community. So we're really happy with this transition. We did it. It was tough work. It can be done. But our job is not done. What most people do not know is that 14% of our electricity still comes from coal, and most of that is out-of-state coal. And how can we keep moving forward in our aggressive agenda for clean energy development if we have unregulated coal from out of state coming in and undercutting our clean energy efforts? We need EPA to step up now and level the playing field for all states as we here have done our actions. But I want to be more specific about why this rule is so important. We have right now our largest utility in the state, Puget Sound Energy, has just submitted their long-range plan to our state regulators. In that plan, they said they're going to double down and continue to dump ratepayer money into their dirty and dangerous coal plant in Colstrip, Montana. Part of the reason they say they're going to be holding on to that coal plant for another 20 years is because they say there will be no carbon price. They are asserting there will be no carbon price on that coal plant for at least 20 years. And because of that, they are committing ratepayer money to keep investing in that plant for at least another 20 years. So it's clear now what EPA can do. But I want to be even more specific about why this is so important. That plant that is owned by Puget Sound Energy, Avista, and Pacific Corp, as well as 3 other energy companies, in 2011, EPA rated this coal plant the dirtiest, single largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the entire West. How can we possibly keep moving forward with clean energy when we allow this humongous plant that has 17 million tons of carbon a year continue to dump its dirty energy in our state without being regulated? 17 million tons of carbon a year, that's equivalent to 3 million cars. That's half of all passenger cars in Washington State. Imagine the transition to clean energy if we were able to move past that dirty source of fuel, redirect that money into Washington State for clean energy jobs and investments. So we've made tremendous progress. We have much more to go. We're at the beginning of a clean energy revolution in Washington State, and it is dirty power plants like the Colstrip plant in Montana that's standing in our way. We need EPA to do the right thing. Our first speaker today is Zach Hutchins, Representative Zach Hutchins from the 11th District, just south of here. That includes Renton, Tukwila, Kent, and South Seattle. Zach was one of our champions on the transition plan that we did for the TransAlta coal plant. He is chair of the House Committee on General Government Appropriations, and that oversees approximately $3 billion of spending on 68 different state agencies, so he's a position of power and yields quite a bit of influence for all of us. He was recognized recognized as one of the legislators of the year by the Washington Conservation voters. His primary focus is on creating and keeping jobs, and that's what this transition is all about, bringing those good jobs here to Washington and making our government more effective and efficient and protecting citizens, especially those from low-income and minority communities. He also serves on a bunch of boards, and one of the boards that he sits on is South Seattle Community College, the President's Advisory Committee. They are an incubation machine for the clean energy jobs of the future. Another example of the transition that's already underway. I'm so glad we have folks like Zach that are leading the way for us. Please welcome Representative Zach Hudgens.
Thank you very much, Doug. This sign right here, South Park will be flooded, freaks me out because I was in South Park twice today already, and it talks about, right here, South Park will be flooded, shows us the impacts of climate change. Whether it's the projections about how much of Florida is going to be put underwater, or whether it's the superstorm Sandy, or whether it's the impacts to our communities right here in Washington State, I realize that it is from sea to shining sea. And that sort of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Yeah. Right? And it sounds familiar, of course, because of the song from 100 years ago. It's sort of interesting that it's been 100 years. Oh, beautiful, spacious skies, amber waves of grain, purple mountains' majesty, fruited plains. Sort of an image of America that we have and we believe in that will be impacted by climate change if we don't do anything. I'm here today because we need to do something about carbon pollution, and Washington State is one of the places that is leading the way. We've done it here in Washington State. Places like Seattle have become carbon neutral, and Washington State, through the voters' push with 937, has required clean energy. We've got state tax credit tax production credits for solar energy if you put it on your roofs. We've got solar community projects like in Jefferson Park in my district on Beacon Hill that are showing that people can come together to solve these problems. They can come together to make sure that government's working in the right direction. And that's why I'm here, is because we need to continue to follow the path that Washington State, that President Obama, that Governor Inslee, and the legislature has set for us to make sure that we're addressing carbon pollution for the future. This sign says it's our obligation. I have a 2-year-old son. His name's Sebastian. Couldn't be here today because it's raining, and he's with his grandparents. I don't want my 2-year-old son to inherit a world where we are worried constantly about the magnitude of the forest fires that are hitting us, the magnitude of the floods that are hitting us, the magnitude of the storms that have continued energy costs going up and up and up, as well as pollution problems. South Park, that's mentioned right here, not only has flooding issues because it's along the river, but it also has some of the biggest health discrepancies in the state. It's got some of the highest child asthma rates in the state. If we don't do something about particulate matter and air quality issues, carbon pollution, we're going to see it in our healthcare system, we're going to see it in our education system, we're going to see the impacts to our communities, to our jobs, to our companies. We need to do something. We can do something. I want to thank you all for being here today. Government's leading the way, and it's only because the people are pushing us. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm Zach Hudgens.
All right, I'm going to have to, if my speakers don't mind, we're going to have to try to speed things up, so I'm going to give you a short version. And our next speaker is Travis Bryan from One Energy Renewables. They are developing solar, utility-scale solar and wind. Travis has had a long experience as previous director with BlackRock, where he led a global team with research operations, communications on a multi-billion-dollar portfolio of hedge funds and private equity investments. He comes from the business community. Here's the voice of the business community. So we're very happy to have you here. And I want to say just one thing to tee him up. We did a jobs analysis about the transition off dirty power to clean energy with our jobs report. And what we find is that when we replace this dirty power that's coming into Washington State, there will be thousands of new clean energy jobs, exactly like the ones that Travis helps create. Travis.
Thanks very much, Doug, and I want to thank the Sierra Club for this event. First I'm just drawn to the saying on the signs here, it's our obligation. Representative Hutchins mentioned, I'd go a little further. I'd say this is a moral and an economic imperative. I really believe strongly that climate change is real, and I don't have to believe anymore. The evidence now is unequivocal. It's real, it's happening, it's here, it's affecting a lot of people. And we have to do something about it. If we delay, it's going to create a larger and larger cost. So Representative Hutchins mentioned some of the costs, and you'll hear more, I think, about the threats to public safety from some of the other speakers. And Tamara and Michael will elaborate. But it's obviously costing us billions of dollars. It's taking lives. This is a serious issue, and the science is clear. Now, not only will the problems get worse, but they're increasingly affecting communities and people that I think can least afford to pay for it, least afford to suffer the burdens. So it's a matter of justice. And as a father of little kids, I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. I want them to inherit a world that we respect, that we took care of, a world that contains I think, a measure of justice that we're failing to meet right now. We have to deal with this problem. Now, I'm here today because this EPA rule is of tremendous importance. Now, the very best way, I think, to deal with climate change is to reduce our carbon emissions. The power sector is a critical part of it. It's 40% of the U.S. carbon emissions. We have to deal with coal. We have to deal with carbon emissions. Now, renewable energy is an important part of the solution. At my company, we develop large-scale solar projects. We work with wind and other forms of clean power. It's cost competitive today. It's already here. These solutions are arriving. This is something that we can do. It's been proven in many markets. It's the lowest cost source of new electricity in a multitude of markets. That number is growing. Places like California, Iowa, here in the Northwest, we're reaching levels of magnitude of renewable energy that people thought were impossible maybe 5-10 years ago. Yeah. Places like Germany and places in Europe like Denmark are achieving even higher levels that should challenge our conceptions of what we can achieve with clean power. I think the rest of the country can benefit from the leadership that we have here in the Northwest. I really want to commend the efforts we've made in the legislature, led in part by a lot of good folks like Representative Hutchins. The state mandate we have is essential, particularly given the dysfunction and inaction we have in Congress. But there's also a lot of good reasons to find hope in the private sector. My background's in the markets. I'm very proud of the activities of some of our largest and leading companies here in the Northwest. Starbucks, an amazing commitment to sustainability. Microsoft with an internal carbon fee. The private sector is doing its part as well. But as Doug mentioned, we are going to struggle to compete in a clean economy if other states and the rest of the country does not pick up its part of the deal. Now, we are based here in the Northwest. Our projects are around the country, but we like to be here because this is where the human capital is located. We want to hire people here. I want to live here. I want my kids to grow up here. This is a very vibrant sector, and I think we can build a lot. I hope the EPA picks up a lot of that message from its listening session today. But I want to close with this message that the private sector, as much as it's doing, and the markets can't fix this problem on its own. And this is a market failure. It's a classic market failure. And that we cannot allow, I don't think it should be allowed for companies to keep all of the profits associated with carbon-intensive activities, carbon reduction, without reducing their carbon footprint, especially while other people, and especially disadvantaged communities, are suffering the costs, suffering the consequences. So if we want this to change, we have to start now. We have to change the rules. Policies like Section 111 of the EPA are critical. I fully support the President's Climate Action Plan. Pleased to see the number of people out today. We're making progress. We have to do more. And thank you again for your time. Travis Bryan from One Energy Renewables.
Great.
Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Medler from Western Washington University. He is a professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at Huxley College at Western Washington. He specializes in GIS and statistical analysis, and in particular has worked a lot on forests, and Michael is going to talk to us about climate impacts. Thank you, Michael.
All right, well, I'm focusing in on one specific example. As I said, my name is Michael Medler, and I've been the founding editor of the journal Fire Ecology. I've been president of the Association for Fire Ecology, and I've been researching forest fires for about 20 years, and I've testified before congressional committees about the linkages between climate and wildland fire. Now, in the 80s, I was a wildland firefighter. I cut my teeth cutting fire lines and fires in places like Yellowstone in the 80s. And back then, 20 to 40,000 acres was considered a huge fire. Nowadays, you probably wouldn't hear about those. Big fires are 10, 20 times that size now. And we're having longer fire seasons, 2 months longer than we used to have just a couple decades ago. And these large fires, like the large rim fire in Yosemite recently, have big areas that are burning much hotter than we're used to seeing. We're seeing large patches of trees killed in ways that we're not used to. Now, there is now scientific consensus, very strong scientific consensus that climate change is affecting wildland fires in a lot of different ways. Fires in the US are bigger, they are hotter, and they're way more expensive. And the fire season is about 2 months longer than just back when I was working in the Forest Service. This situation is not political anymore. Lloyd's of London has been putting out reports for several years telling insurers around the country and around the world to start preparing for large losses associated with wildland fires. If you don't want to listen to anybody else, think about what that means when Lloyd's of London is warning insurance companies that we're going to switch from hundreds of houses destroyed in the summers to thousands, tens of thousands, maybe more, as we have hotter and larger fires. Now, fires larger than about 1 square kilometer account for about 95% of the area of fires that burn in this country. And these fires are almost always associated with extreme weather conditions, extreme fire conditions. In fact, they can only happen a few days a year. Many people don't understand. I think today you can imagine if I went out and tried to light a fire on a rainy Seattle day like today, it's not going anywhere. These big fires occur at the peak temperatures, low humidities, high winds that only occur very rarely. Now what happens is that we are changing that system. Now, for example, the Yarnell Hill fire last year that killed 19 firefighters, the most we've killed in about 80 years. The huge fires in Australia in 2009 that killed over 170 people occurred while we were breaking weather records. Temperatures several degrees above anything people had seen in those areas sometimes before that, particularly in Australia. The problem with climate change and then fire is that small changes in things like the average temperature or the lengths of the droughts we're experiencing can have profound effects on how many days of extreme fire weather occur. A few degrees higher average temperature doesn't just mean you'll have a few more days with high temperatures. It means the temperatures that you used to have just 1 or 2 days a year are no longer those big high expected peaks. And you're going to start seeing this year's record temperatures not occurring once in a 3 or 4 year period, but starting to occur 8, 9, 10 times possibly in a given summer. So you're going to be magnifying the amount of time that we can be experiencing these kinds of extreme fires, placing a lot more people in a lot more community in harm's way. For example, recent studies have been looking at, say, the Yellowstone region, and they found that the fires there have traditionally occurred every 300 to 500 years or so. They could imagine the entire landscape burned on that kind of time period. With the kind of changes we're expecting to see with just moderate climate change associated with this extensive amount of carbon being put in the atmosphere, that fire return interval in that area may be down to 30 years. Entire Yellowstone region being burned over, all of it, on a 30-year period, which makes for huge changes in the ecosystem and all of the communities nearby. Same thing can be happening all over the country in many different places. For example, here in Washington, on the west side, on this very wet-looking west side, many of these forests historically burn on ranges like 500 to 1,000 years. It wouldn't take that much to change that. What we would think of, oh, a couple degrees warmer in the summer, how big of a difference can that make? Well, it could make the weather here drier longer. We might start seeing 60, 70-day droughts more often in the summer, like they see in Northern California in summer and Southern Oregon, and we would start seeing fire behavior like we see there. These same large Douglas fir forests could be burning every 30 years instead of every 1,000, for example. And so these kinds of large changes can be brought about by what sound like small changes, like, oh, a few degrees Celsius change in average temperature, and that's because of this power of statistical curves. If we bump the top up just a little bit, that part right below the top becomes a lot bigger, and we start seeing a lot more of those days. And so that's one of my main concerns that I want to bring forward today, is we're not talking about small, subtle changes. We're talking about climate and fire changes that may be orders of magnitude bigger, time periods that are shorter, fires that are larger than anything we've expected in the past. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, our last speaker is Tamara Rubin with Mom Rising, and Tamara, you're going to have a tough road to hoe because you're going to have to try to make it really fast. We've been told we need to get in the hearing room as soon as possible. Let me just say this about Tamara. Her own kids experienced some environmental impacts through lead poisoning, and through that, it really expanded her work into the national stage of raising awareness to threats to children from environmental hazards. That's now has extended to climate change. Tamara is here representing all of us. I have kids, Zach has kids, Michael has kids, Travis has kids. That's ultimately what this is about.
So I live in Oregon, in Portland, and I have 4 sons. And really, this is about living with medically fragile children and what happens when they start to be impacted by climate change. Just wanted to rattle off a couple facts that haven't been mentioned yet. I don't know if you know about Leonardo Tresande's environmental impact report about the cost of environmental illness for children. It's 76.6 billion annually, and that only includes the lost earning potential and the immediate medical costs of kids, 76.6 billion annually. And that doesn't include the other costs that families who have children who suffer from environmental illnesses have, costs like lost earning of parents and having to relocate and things like that. And it doesn't include the impact of the ongoing trace levels of toxicity in our air that impacts these kids, and that we're learning impacts them at greater and greater in greater scope than we realized before. Just with lead and with all the other chemicals, we're realizing even the very trace levels are the reasons for ADD, ADHD, autism. They might be not the initial reason, but they might be the trigger. And this hit us personally in terms of the impact of the air on our children. When we were visiting Washington last year, Washington State, we called. It was just after the Wenatchee fire. We made sure that the air quality was good. We heard from all the reports that it was safe for medically fragile people. We could come to Washington State. It was a big decision because we have medically fragile children. And we came here, and within a few hours, my youngest son was in the hospital. And this is when the people who say that the air is fine and safe said the air was fine and safe, and it wasn't. It was so bad that he was in the hospital within just a few hours of arriving here. And so, you know, that informed our choice, what the federal standards are for air safety and air quality, and that's informing choices of other families that's still impacting their children. And then what I wanted to say was Healthy Child, Healthy World says that everyone can do something, but no one can do everything, so we all need to work together on this. In my family, we're car-free in Portland. We use alternative energy in our home. My son has a solar backpack to charge his phone, but none of these things are enough to make a difference. They're more like a statement and a life choice of a family, and that it's going to take the corporate community in our country, because they have children and grandchildren too. It's going to take their efforts on the power of the scale that they can make a difference to actually impact the lives of our children and our grandchildren in the future. And not only do they have the power to make this difference, they have the moral obligation and the responsibility for all of our kids and their grandkids.
Thank you. All right, let's move next door. I presume we need to move next door, is that right?
Yes. And if everyone can pack in towards the front.